Yeah. A little bit of Johnny never hurts nobody. Here's Johnny. Loopy's a madman, help us see. You remember that one?
I do.
Pretty marvelous. Wait.
Thanks.
My God. It's on.
Got a question for you.
Okay.
So I was on the place called Facebook, right?
Beg your pardon?
I was on the place called Facebook.
Place called Facebook.
Yeah. And I was scrolling through there and someone shared a post from the other 98%. You know them, they are very far left leaning. And the post says, can we stop calling it inflation, call it by its actual names, price gouging and corporate greed? What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah.
I didn't comment, I scrolled down.
The question is always, all right, so the question that's brought to us this morning, this afternoon is that what we're talking about as currently being inflation should really be called what it actually is, which is, you said, price gouging?
And corporate greed.
And corporate greed. Excellent. But the puzzle is, why now? It tends to be a static point of view. The puzzle is always, well, why now? Are corporations more greedy this year than they were last year? I have the rules changed such that they're able to get away with greed more this year than they were last year. Maybe they discovered some new tricks. That would be a fair explanation if they actually had discovered some new tricks. Maybe they're actually able to get away with capturing greater profits. But to simply identify the current situation as of increasing prices as pertaining only to prices blown up due to corporate greed, that's to assume that people were less greedy last year than they are today, which I think doesn't make sense. It doesn't work out logically in the long run. Yes.
But that's considering circumstances didn't change. Circumstances did change since last year.
If circumstances have changed, then those circumstances are definitely relevant. But that doesn't mean that the individuals who are involved with the corporations are more greedy than they were in the past. Maybe they're able to get away with their greediness more, but we can't impute the outcome on the motivations of the individuals unless we somehow want to also argue that the motivations of the individuals have changed. Or that they have become alert to an opportunity that did not exist before. Which could be true. They have become alert to things that have come that existed before. The other thing that is problematic about that question is that, well, if there's so many profits to be earned, then we ought to expect entry by new firms, which is what I was talking about the entire last hour. You ought to expect more entry by new firms, such that there's greater competition, which push prices down. One of the major difficulties there is that people tend to perceive businesses as competing against consumers, which is total nonsense. Businesses are not competing against consumers. Businesses are competing against other businesses. Businesses bid the price down in a competitive environment. Buyers bid the price up in a competitive environment. So we see the price of meat go up. Okay. So a New York strip goes from $7.99 a pound to $10.99 a pound. Excellent. Okay, why? If there's the same amount of meat available as there was before, then what must have happened? Oh, the producers have become more greedy. No, that doesn't make any sense at all. What must be the case is that buyers are buying more steak. Buyers bid prices up. Sellers push prices down. Simple fact about the competitive process. Right. Now, if sellers are able to sell just as much New York strip today at $10.99 a pound as they used to sell at $7.99 a pound, and buyers are willing to pay $10.99 a pound, where's the problem?
Too expensive.
Where's the problem? No, it's not too expensive, people are still buying it. It's not too expensive.
Problem is buyers are willing to pay $10.99, so they'll be
The
charged.
problem is that somebody else is willing to pay 99, we should go beat that guy up. Right? That way there's less competitors for the state. Okay? We should try to persuade everybody that red meat is bad for you. Actually, I'm in favor of that. Let's persuade everybody that red meat is bad for them. I'd like to see the price of steak go down too. I got my gout pills. I can eat as much steak as I want to.
God.
And beer for that matter. Okay. Thank you for this question. We're having fun now.
I can tell.
I'm entertained. I don't care if you are or not. Right? Yeah, no, these kinds of arguments don't hold up under careful examination, but the problem is, most people haven't thought these things all the way through, which is fine. I'm not angry at them.
Sure.
Right? I'm not angry at them. There's a presumption there also that price gouging is per se bad. Price gouging per se bad. I talked about this in my intro class this morning. There's a hurricane in North Carolina came through, and the prices of essential goods, milk, eggs, water, generators, etc., and the prices did not go up because there is an anti-price gouging law in North Carolina. So the prices did not go up. So what happened?
They ran out.
Everybody sold out. Okay. So the reason for disallowing a price gouging law is that we do not necessarily want to allocate essential goods based upon people's ability to pay. We don't want the wealthy people to get the necessary resources just because they're wealthy. Fair enough. I understand that motivation. However, my mother takes care of my father full time. They were living in North Carolina at the time. My father is disabled. And it's very difficult for my mother to leave my father to go to the store. So the prices being held low meant that not was it more possible for the poor person to afford the essential goods, but that instead of allocating the goods according to individuals' willingness to pay, the goods were allocated according to who got there first. And for my mother, it was hard for her to get there. And she is not amongst the wealthy people. So we're saying that we don't want to allocate goods based upon ability to pay, but we want to allocate goods based upon ability to get to the store before somebody else does. Well, that's not what I meant by that. Of course, it's not what you meant, but have you thought it through? Did you think it through? And particularly for the same people who are concerned, very much as am I, about people who are stuck in food deserts, who are stuck in situations where it's hard to get to a store because of where you live, right? People don't want to put stores there for whatever reasons. Those are the same exact people that can't acquire the goods when there is not a hurricane, or they cannot acquire the goods when prices do go up. The same exact people end up being harmed. Except that we're mostly talking about who captures the surpluses. Are the surpluses flowing to the consumers or to the businesses? And the economist tends to be agnostic about distributions of surpluses. After all, Home Depot is owned by people. And those people are going to respend whatever surpluses they capture and whatever exchanges obtain eventually somewhere else in the economy. The economist is primarily concerned with making sure that whatever surpluses can obtain do, avoiding deadweight losses, avoiding rent-seeking situations, avoiding the waste of resources. Thank you for bearing with me as I step off of my soapbox. Introduction. I want to do this as production. No, I want to continue to talk about expenditure. Okay. This is the wrong camera. Have I allowed for sharing? No. Share screen. And sharing. Everybody can share. Yeah. Here we go. We were talking about how we're not going to include NX in this model. We're talking about a closed economy. We're dealing with a closed economy. We dealt with consumption last time. We said that consumption involves both taxes and income, and that there is presumed a marginal propensity to consume that is less than 1. So there's a slope to it. Now we want to ask what values or things are happening inside of the rate of investment. We understand that investment is the purchase of new capital, goods, and resources for purposes of production. So for greater production in the future. What do most investors look at when deciding how much to invest? Well, primarily their rate of return. The rate of return. They want their rate of return, right, to be greater than the interest rate. So if you can build a factory and make a thing and sell that thing and get a rate of return of 10% and the interest rate is 5%, you're going to do it. However, if the interest rate goes up to 10% or to 11%, you're not going to do it. So then the lower the interest rate, the more investment opportunities that seem worthwhile. You follow? The lower the interest rate, the more investment opportunities that seem worthwhile. And so we get a inverse relationship between the quantity of investment and the interest rate. And so when we think about this in formalized form, we say that an investment is a function of the interest rate and that it is negative. Now, this interest rate is implying the real interest rate. As compared to what? Well, as compared to the nominal rate of interest. What's the difference? Your student loans are articulated in terms of the nominal rate of interest. Right? Some of you have a 6% rate of interest on your student loan. Okay, very good. What if inflation goes up to 4%? Does the nominal rate of interest on your student loan change? Not on the student loans that already exist. However, you might expect that next year, when you go to take out a loan, the rate might have gone up. The nominal rate will have gone up. Irving Fisher basically said that the real interest rate is typically the nominal interest rate minus inflation. Minus the rate of inflation. Or at least the expected rate of inflation. We call this the Fisher equation. If you enter into production or investment, and you're trying to decide how much am I going to buy, how much investment am I going to do, and you have a real interest rate, you know, in the market you think that the real interest rate is 5%. Okay, so you're going to do this amount of investment. However, how do you know what the real interest rate is? Well, you're making a deduction. You're saying, well, I think that the real interest rate is 5 because I observe a nominal interest rate of 7, and I think that inflation is 2. And so you enter into the marketplace and you borrow money at a nominal rate of 7% because you perceive the interest rate in real terms to be 5%. You think that you can get 5.5% rate of return on this investment, so it's worthwhile to you. Are you still with me? Yes, okay. But what you did not know is that the inflation rate was actually 4%. If the inflation rate is 4%, then what is the real interest rate? If the inflation rate is actually 4%, but you're reading, right, a 7% interest rate, and you think that the real interest rate is 5%, you're wrong. You're getting fooled. You think that the interest rate is 2, that the inflation rate is 2, but it's actually 4. So you think that this investment is worthwhile. But it's going to turn out that the real interest rate, right, is actually 7%. Is that how I want to do this? No, I want to say that the real interest rate is actually 3%. This is the indicator that you actually observe in the marketplace. So the truth is that the real interest rate is actually 3%. It's actually much lower than that. Right? And so oh, damn it, we've gone backwards about this. You're misperceiving the real interest rate to be lower than it actually is. The way I should actually do this is that the real interest rate is actually 9%, is actually 7%. And as a result, the investment isn't worthwhile. That's the story that I'm trying to tell you. I'll have to retell it again later. The idea is though that you thought that inflation was low, but it's actually high. The investment that you thought was worthwhile, based upon your nominal expected rate of return, ends up not obtaining. You get a lower real rate of return. As a result, the investment was not worthwhile. You spent money investing in something that ended up not being worthwhile. This is the backbone behind the Austrian perspective on the source of business cycles. They understood that the monetary authorities had artificially reduced interest rates by making money cheap and easy. And so a lot of investment opportunities seemed to be worthwhile. So a lot of investment was made based upon a false signal about the real interest rate. But after when the truth came out, became well known, it turned out that a lot of those investments were what the Austrians call mal investments. And anybody who's watched Firefly knows that mal means bad. You guys watch Firefly? Never? None of you know Firefly? Nathan Fillion's like first major breakout show. No? Let me breathe here for just a moment. That's sci-fi ever. Okay. Okay. So what else do we have left in this equation? Y equals C plus I plus G. We've got T. Go. How are we going to talk about government spending? Well, we're going to say that government spending is, in part, dependent upon taxes. In part. If we have a balanced budget, then government spending is equal to taxes. Setting aside everything having to do with transfers. So taxes that are imposed in order to affect transfers are set aside from this. We only want government spending that's going to be spent on stuff or on employees, but not money that gets taken from Peter to be given to Paul. Those transfers typically show up in consumption. So if government is equal to taxation, then we've got a balanced budget. And since we're talking about the classical point of view, the classical economists generally thought that the government should run a balanced budget. Now that should was not necessarily something that they imposed upon their models. It was something that probably they absorbed from culture at the time. It was commonly thought by most people that the government should run a balanced budget. It was even thought that by most politicians that the government should run a balanced budget. Right? It wasn't until after World War II sometime that we started thinking that, oh, it's okay to run a major deficit sometimes. When particularly during times when we're not in war, it was always considered prudent to borrow money during a war in order to win the war. But in peacetime, it was never really considered wise for the government to borrow money. The Keynesian revolution sort of suggested that we can borrow money in order to get out of a recession. So, okay, what then? We end up with a model for aggregate demand. And this model for aggregate demand includes consumption, which is described as income minus taxes, plus investment, which is a function of the interest rate, plus government spending. So typically we'll be given a homework problem, right, that includes all these variables and has given to us some values for some of these variables, and then we have to solve. We have to solve something. Now, we're going to assume that that output is relatively constant, that taxes are held constant, and that government spending are held constant, and that the economy is brought into equilibrium through adjustments in the interest rate. This is an approach that makes sense to an economist because how would you define the interest rate? What does the interest rate tell us? Or what is the foundational source of there being an interest rate? Those of you who had me for intro. The interest rate is the time price of money. It is the time price of money. And economists like to set up their models with a price on the y-axis in order to bring the market into equilibrium. They say, okay, markets are equilibrated through adjustments in the price. And so if we find a price in our model, then that price is going to be the thing that brings the market into equilibrium. So the economist, the macroeconomist, imposes or borrows this price mechanism for equilibration and uses the interest rate as the price in order to bring the macro economy into equilibrium. Now, I said that the interest rate is the time price of money. Let me give a short story now. I don't know if this is where I intended to explain this in my notes, I can't remember. I got hit by a car yesterday, so I'm giving myself some freedom here to talk about when I talk about things. I won't remember whether I said it or not anyway, except that I've got a recording of it. Okay. If I say something twice, you can just shout at me and say, no, you said that twice. Which I will respond, I don't care. All right. I took my daughters to the grocery store. They were little girls. And on the way out of the grocery store, there was one of those little gumball machines. And in the little gumball machine, you put a quarter in, you get out a gumball, right? My youngest daughter asked me, Papa, can we have a gumball, please? And I said, well, you could either have a gumball now or ice cream after dinner. A dilemma. A real serious dilemma. Because you see, for each of my daughters, for both of my daughters, ice cream is preferable to gumballs. As well it should be. I think I've already talked a little bit about ice cream today. Ice cream is preferable to gumballs. Now, ice cream right now is preferable to gumballs right now. Similarly, if we were talking about after dinner, ice cream later would still be preferable to a gumball later. And this would be true for anybody, almost. At least it was true for both of my daughters. However, my eldest preferred ice cream later over a gumball now. And my youngest preferred a gumball now over ice cream later. The world has been shaken. What's going on? How can it be true? Well, there are differences amongst each of us in subjective time preferences. Some of us have a shorter time horizon than others. Perhaps my older daughter has lived a little bit longer and has learned that she can be patient. Right? I'm not going to add a value judgment to that. We're not going to say that it is wiser to have a longer time horizon. You have your preferences, whatever they are. And there are differences amongst us in our time preferences. Having a preference for a gumball now rather than an ice cream later does not mean that you are a bad person. It just means that you will probably consume more gumballs than ice cream. You might have a preference for wine over grapes. I once met a wino sitting on the corner eating grapes. I was like, dude, you have to wait. What determines whether you will actually ever consume any wine? Your willingness to wait. There is an interest rate involved between grapes and wine. And in some countries, we never observed them developing wine, maybe because they were impatient. Okay? The price of wine is higher than the price of grapes to the extent that you have to wait. It's the same amount of fluid, but you have to wait. If the seller of wine could not capture a higher price for the wine than the grapes, then they would just sell the grapes, because they also prefer to have the money now compared to later. Are you with me? Even in countries where there is no money, where there is no banking, where there is no record of an interest rate in financial markets, we can observe that there are differences in interest rates because we do observe wine. What other things do you have to wait for that we might be able to observe? Cheese. Right? You can observe cheese in some places. You have to wait in order to get cheese from milk. You also might observe tools. Tools represent having put aside some capital, having reduced your consumption today in order to develop the tools so that you can consume more tomorrow. If you observe tools, then you're observing an interest rate. Interest is simply the time price of money, but it's also the time price of consumption, of delayed consumption. Or how much more can you have tomorrow as compared to today? We can actually put that on the production possibility frontier. Right? We can say, okay, we know that between coconuts and fishes, right? My consumption today is this. If I make a net, then my consumption will increase. Okay, so I can measure, right, my increase in utility by moving from point A to point B. But the puzzle is, before I can get there, I have to wait. I have to postpone some consumption, so I have to consume less in the short run in order to develop the machinery, the capital, in order to capture more fish. The decision about whether or not to make a net, or how many nets to make, is a decision about how long I'm willing to delay satisfaction and what the increase in productivity is that I expect to emerge. That is the foundation of all interest rates. Am I making sense to you? Right? I have to give up 3 fishes and 2 coconuts, right, a week for 3 weeks in order to increase my total productivity to 7 fishes and 9 coconuts or whatever, right? You can calculate the benefit, the return, the rate of return from having waited. The question is, how long are you willing to wait? And how much are you giving up to get something? There's trade-offs. And trade-offs, all trade-offs are, is give up this in order to get that. Well, how much of this and how much of that, that generates a ratio. And that ratio is a relative price. And we normalize that by using money in place of one of the goods that we're consuming. Now, our aggregate supply curve, we say, is given by our production function. So then if we assume that we're producing at the maximum possible level that we can, then our capital and labor inputs are going to be fixed. Our aggregate demand curve is described as I just did before. I'll do it one more again. Output is fixed, taxes are fixed, the interest rate is not fixed, government spending is also fixed. We end up with a graph where aggregate supply, because all of the variables involved in aggregate supply are fixed, we get a fixed aggregate supply curve that is not sensitive to the interest rate. Our aggregate demand curve, in the meantime, is downward sloping, and this is also why, is downward sloping because of the negative term here. And the variable that brings them into equilibrium is the interest rate. Now, this model that I drew here, we'll come back to this for just a second. The fact that you give up something in the short run in order to get more later on is sometimes described as the roundabout way to wealth. The roundabout way to wealth. Eugen von Baltark was amongst those that talked about the roundabout approach. I think David Ricardo also had something to say about roundaboutness as approach to getting to wealth. The demand is that we buy stuff to make stuff. When we're talking about, actually, here we want to talk for a second about the loanable funds market for borrowing and lending. The demand side of the loanable funds market is for investment. The supply side of the loanable funds market is savings. And the price that emerges in the loanable funds market is the real interest rate. So interestingly, here we have investment and savings being used differently. The terms investment and savings are being used differently. Investment is the buying of capital in order to make other equipment. Savings is postponed consumption. It's postponed consumption. So this is sort of factoring in, right, through that investment variable in our equation. Savings is factoring in through our marginal propensity to consume variable. And we come into equilibrium through the real interest rate. Savings are poured into banks, typically, or into other financial assets. Savings in this sense is money being put into the market for loanable funds. It is really the supply curve in the market for loanable funds, where the price is the interest rate. Okay? And the higher the real interest rate, the more willing people are going to be to postpone consumption today and to save more to spend tomorrow. The demand side is for investment, and so we can describe that as this side of the equation, investment or demand. And the market comes to an equilibrium about a real interest rate. So that emerges because this investor right here has an idea that has a rate of return such that their demand to borrow is less than what anybody would be willing to lend to them at. Nobody's willing to lend to them at that low of a rate. So the rate of return is not enough to justify borrowing at that rate. So this exchange does not obtain between borrowers and lenders. Who saves? Generally, we think about savings primarily as happening by individuals. So individuals have their income, they consume some stuff, right? And how much do they actually save? Well, we want to say that private savings is not just what they don't consume, but they also have to pay their taxes. So private savings, say by consumers, is equal to income minus taxes minus what they actually consume. Government also saves. The government will save whatever they collect in taxes minus what they pay out in spending. So it's their surplus. Total savings for a nation, for national savings, will be the sum of these two. So y minus t minus c plus t minus g. Obviously, you can cancel out the t's. Right? And you're left with just y minus c minus g. And that is national savings. The t cancels. So how do we want to think these things through? What do they do for us? You know that savings for the nation is equal to y minus c minus g. I want to think about this. I also say that it's equal to y input minus consumption as a variable of y minus t minus g, right? And this is savings when it is in equilibrium with an investment that is equal to the interest rate or to the level of investment. And if in equilibrium, the total level of savings is equal to the total level of investment. Okay, so we can say here that if we have a balanced budget, if G is equal to T, then we have Y minus I don't want to get to this. We could just basically say that this is equal to savings. That savings is equal to investment. That's the point that I was trying to get to. So the interest rate brings all these things into equilibrium, and we might redraw the local funds market as being the market for investment and savings. If savings is fixed and investment is function like this, right? The market comes into equilibrium about a particular interest rate. So what do we do with all this? Well, we mess with it. We use it as a framework to think through other kinds of issues that can happen. For example, we might think about fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is a decision by the government to change spending or to change taxes. So fiscal policy has to do with a change in government spending or a change in taxation. So, we start again with this model y equals c plus I plus g. We expand it to get more detailed. We say, y equals c, it's a level of consumption based upon output and taxes plus investment plus government spending. All right, now the question is, what happens if we increase government spending? What if government spending increases? If we can't change the overall level of output and government spending increases, then something must either have happened to consumption or to interest rate. If we're going to hold taxes constant, we're holding taxes constant and we're holding output constant, then consumption isn't going to change. In that case, the only thing that can change if we increase government spending is that there will be a change in the interest rate. Remember that the interest rate comes out as a negative sign. So if spending goes up, that must mean that investment goes down. So if the government spends more and doesn't tax more, it crowds out investment in the private sector. It's a story you've probably heard before. How does the government spend more if it's not taxing more? What does the government do to spend more if it's not taxing more? What are possible approaches? Where does the government get the money from? Yeah.
It could cut spending from other projects.
Okay, you get spending from other projects, but it's increasing spending overall in aggregate. So where does the government get the money to spend if it's not charging more taxes? Yes.
They borrow.
Sure, the government borrows money. Right? The government can't finance its operations the way a business can it? A business can finance its operations by selling shares in the corporation. Right? Can you buy or sell shares in the United States government? Not really. Maybe buying citizenship somehow is like buying a share of the United States government, somehow becoming an immigrant if there were a specific fee paid to the government to become an immigrant and receive citizenship as a result. My God, that might actually cause the migration market to clear. What a brilliant idea. Okay, sorry. It's not right to charge people. Not right to charge people for kidneys either, but it turns out more people get kidneys when you do charge for them. Worth it to that guy. Okay. I really went off on a tangent for a second there. Also, I was hit by a car yesterday, so keep using that excuse as long as I want to. The government can't finance its operations by selling shares. Instead, it has to issue bonds. It has to take out loans. The bonds that the government issues are literally loans. They're articulated at a particular interest rate, and then they are bought or sold on the open market based upon the closeness of the articulated interest rate to what we perceive to be the real interest rate in markets. That's how the government gets money. Well, the government's borrowing money in the market for loanable funds. The government's borrowing money in the market for loanable funds at a particular interest rate. They must be crowding out other investors who also are trying to borrow money. As a result, you have a decrease in investment and no change in aggregate demand or an actual total economic activity. The government could similarly cut taxes and leave government spending the same. The result would be analogous. Same result. If you cut taxes, that will cause and leave government spending the same, then you're affecting consumers. They have more money to spend, but output is the same. Where are they going to spend it? It's going to flow through into the interest rate. Okay. Sorry. How do these kinds of puzzles get played out? Suppose that an economy's production function is a Cobb-Douglas production function with alpha equal to 0.3. Cobb-Douglas production function simply means this, right? Okay. What fractions of income do capital and labor receive? We understand that the marginal productivity of labor is equal to 1 minus alpha times y divided by L. And that the marginal productivity of capital is equal to alpha times y over k. From that we can solve. And we end up with the result that the labor receives 70% of output or income, and capital receives 30% of output. Competitive profit maximizing firms will hire labor until its marginal product equals its real wage. So the wage over the price is equal to the marginal productivity of labor. And that is equal to 1 minus alpha times y over L. And if we rewrite this, we can get W over P times L is equal to the marginal productivity of labor times the quantity of labor. I mean, this should be equal to 1 minus alpha times y. And here we observe that that the total payment to all of labor, all of the workers, the wages of each worker times the number of workers, is equal to 1 minus alpha times y. If alpha is 0.3, then we can say that the share to labor is 70% of total income. We could do the same for for capital. To show that the share that gets paid to capital is 30%. Okay. Then we might ask, suppose that immigration increases the labor force by 10%. What would happen to total output? Okay, well, if we're starting with that, and the total labor force increases by 10%, how would we think this through? We might say that, okay, we remember that output is equal to this function. Okay, and let y1 equal the initial quantity of output, given a certain quantity of capital and labor. Okay. And let that be equal to K 0.3, L 0.7. What happens if the labor force increases by 10%? Well, then we would have a situation where the amount of capital is the same, but the quantity of labor is now 1.1 times the amount of labor that existed before. There's more laborers, there's 10% more laborers. One would just be the number of laborers, 10% more would be 1.1 times the number of laborers. Now, how is this going to affect everything else? To calculate the factor change in output, how much more output would this produce? Right? We take y2 divided by y1, and we'd have to take this y2, right, divided by this y1. What do we get? We get a k to the 0.3, 1.1, L to the 0.7, all over a k to the 0.3 times L to the 0.7, all of which basically washes out to every one of these things cancels, except that we get y2 over y1 equals 1.1 raised to the power of 0.7. Which is to say that, and that equals 1.069. So that a 10% increase in quantity of laborers results in a 6.9% increase in total output. You see what I've done here? I've said, okay, if I increase the amount of labor by 10%, how does that affect everything else? Well, it increases total output by 6.9%. How does that affect the rental price of capital? This will be the last thing I do. I just got hit by a car. The rental price of capital is equal to the marginal productivity of capital, which is equal to alpha times a k alpha minus 1, L1 minus alpha. You know that alpha is 0.3. So this is 0.3 divided, 0.3 minus 1 is negative 0.7. 1 minus that is positive 0.7. All right, so this is both before and after. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to take the rental price of capital before and after. After, we're going to do the same thing, have 1.1 in place of that L. Right, we work it all out. R over P2 equals the marginal price of productivity of capital in the second case, equal to 0.3 times A times K to the negative 0.7 times 1.1 L to the positive 0.7. Divide this by this. And again, we get R over P2 divided by R over P1 equals 1.1 to the 0.7, which again is 1.069, which is to say that the rental price of capital increases by 6.9%. Interesting. If you own a piece of capital beforehand, before there was an increase in the number of laborers, if you own a piece of capital before there was an increase in the number of laborers, you are now earning more with that unit of capital. There are more workers to work your capital, so the rental price of the unit of capital that you owned beforehand goes up. If I were to work this out and also show the result to labor, what happens to W over P? I mean, cut short to the result. The result is that W over P goes to 0.972. That is, workers are all earning less, but the owners of capital are all earning more. So immigration tends to harm incumbent workers, but it tends to benefit owners of capital. Okay, it's an interesting result. It's a little bit simplified, but we can test it using other ideas. But this is how, using the compoundless production function and what we understand so far, the relationship between capital and labor, can provide us some insight into policy discussions. See you next time.
It also-